Hi, I'm Jason Molesky. I'm a doctoral candidate at Princeton, where I study American literature and the environmental humanities. My current research examines literary works about the American company towns that have been established all over the world since the late 19th century. I've also done several public-facing essays that draw on my experiences of fossil fuel extraction in western Pennsylvania, where I grew up. In fact, prior to entering academia, I worked there intermittently for several years as an underground coal miner, making me the fifth generation in my family to have done so. Since that time, my perspectives on energy have changed considerably. Most of the remaining mines have closed, and we have seen the area become an epicenter of unconventional natural gas extraction, that is to say, of hydrofracking or fracking. There is actually a well complex about 500 feet from my parents' home, roughly 50 more of them within a 5-mile radius, and some 12,500 wells in the state as a whole, which now produces more natural gas annually than all but a handful of countries. As you may imagine, the surreal impacts all of this drilling has had on community well-being and on my parents' well-being certainly informs my writing and scholarship on the subject, which I'll soon discuss. First, though, I'd like to thank Ashley Dawson, Aloka Matia, and the editorial team at Modern Fiction Studies for putting together this special issue, and also for their terrific introduction, which will very likely become a touchstone in the field. My contribution attempts to develop some initial frameworks through which we might begin thinking about what is now a fairly substantial body of American writing and art about hydrofracking that has emerged since around 2010. And this includes Jennifer Hayes' remarkable 2016 novel, Heat and Light, which I analyze in the essay's final section. Now, on the most macro level, the sheer existence of these works suggests that American authors and publishing houses are finally beginning to grapple with the realities of the fossil fuel industry. It was in 1990 that Amitav Ghosh famously argued that no American writer was paying serious attention to the oil and gas operations underlying the nation's power. The onset of hydrofracking domestically seems to have changed this to some extent, however, perhaps because U.S. media capitals are no longer completely insulated from the worst violence of the drilling industry, many of them being located just downstream from some of these well clusters in Pennsylvania. And so what we have here is a scenario in which the aggressive practices that have long been common in extraction zones throughout the global South have come back in a sense to the imperial core, and the literary silence that Ghosh noted has begun to give way. As to what is most distinctive about hydrofracking texts, I draw on Lawrence Buell's work on toxic discourse to argue that the garish toxicity of hydrofracking, along with the drilling industry's tireless attempts to convince us that it is not occurring, encourages writers to portray hydrofracking zones using the generic resources of Gothic literature. Hayes' novel seems to invoke the Gothic with the greatest degree of self-awareness. On the evening the drilling begins, it is a dark and stormy night. The novel even features a preacher's ghost, a figure very common in the Gothic tradition. But nearly all the texts that I discuss depict chemical violence in broadly Gothic terms as a kind of grotesque, shadowy force of contagion spreading through our air and water, even as its existence is denied by official discourse from industry and government. Before discussing how these texts may lead to shifts in the ways that we read toxicity, I should probably say a bit about hydrofracking itself and about how the industry operates. As you may know, hydrofracking is a new and highly toxic method of extracting oil and natural gas from hard shale formations deep underground. It's really a marvel of engineering, ultimately involving the subterranean superinjection of millions of gallons of a chemical slurry, which releases the oil or gas from the rock. At this point, more than 1,000 scientific studies have shown that health impacts, ranging from rashes to birth defects, are associated with hydrofracking, and this has led many nations to ban the practice outright. This has not happened in the United States, of course, where more than 100,000 new hydrofracking sites have begun operations within the last 15 years across roughly a dozen extraction zones or shale plays all over the country. This development has transformed the nation into a fossil energy superpower, the world's leading producer of both oil and natural gas. There is currently a spree of new pipelines, power plants, intercontinental shipping hubs under construction across the United States, and indeed in many other parts of the world, to support the continued rise of American hydrofracking. And so, in the absence of meaningful political intervention, to encourage a shift towards zero-emission sources of energy, the sunk capital costs of all of this infrastructure will likely commit us to the fossil energy system for the next half century, if not longer. And this takes us well into the realm of dangerous tipping points for the climate, not to mention the severe daily impacts on the air and water of frontline communities like the one where my parents live, and eventually the downstream effects of this toxicity on other places as it spreads through the food system and the water table. Ashley Dawson was one of the first to explicitly recognize that the environmental dangers of hydrofracking go beyond even those of conventional forms of extraction. To mark this distinction, he calls hydrofracking a form of extreme extraction. Others include mountaintop removal coal mining, tar sands extraction, and ultra-deepwater drilling. To Dawson's insight here, I might add that extreme forms of fossil fuel extraction entail equally extreme methods of information control and archival erasure on the part of industry and its enablers in government. To describe these methods across a variety of contexts, social scientists have recently begun using the term agnotology, which refers to the study and the practice of inducing ignorance, uncertainty, or doubt within a broad population, usually for the purpose of suppressing dissent. The word comes from the Greek agnosis, meaning not knowing. And we see this applied in cigarette marketing and climate change denial, of course, but it is absolutely crucial to the continued operations of the fossil fuel industry, as the anthropologist Sarah Ann Wiley argues in her very useful new book, Fractivism. Here, Wiley discusses how hydrofracking has received exemptions from nearly all federal environmental laws. Along with this kind of regulatory capture, she outlines how the industry uses complex chains of subcontractors and shell companies to fragment information, making it nearly impossible for any outside party to later reconstruct the narrative of toxic contamination that may have taken place at any given drilling site. Wiley calls this the regime of imperceptibility. Additionally, the industry requires nondisclosure agreements of anyone who seeks restitution for damages. And this means that in exchange for the money needed to flee a contaminated space, afflicted persons must legally surrender the right to speak about their experiences of hydrofracking for the rest of their lives, and sometimes even beyond that, insofar as documents may not be able to be released after death. Eliza Griswold discusses the details of how these agnotological techniques are used in Pennsylvania and other fracking areas in her Pulitzer Prize-winning expose, Amity and Prosperity. Similarly, Julia Kasdorf employs an innovative style of documentary poetry to incorporate many of them into her recent collection, Shale Play, another work that I discuss in the essay. But it is not only the literary, of course, that is impacted when the oil and gas industry uses its power to cover up the harms of extreme extraction. Just as fossil fuels are said to move downstream from the refinery towards the end user, so might the culture of disinformation that extreme extraction fosters. Under these circumstances, political life more broadly can easily be pushed even further into the realm of conspiracy, distrust, and dysfunction. Building on Dawson's insight, then, we might say that hydrofracking and other forms of extreme extraction encourage an extreme information environment, one that relies on false and fragmented narratives, and creates a sense of pervasive uncertainty that precludes any real change. Effectively, the industry's agnotological practices, as they are brought to bear on frontline residents, attempt to transform lived experiences of toxicity into a kind of haunting, something almost supernatural in character. As a result, what we see in literary works by Griswold, Kasdorf, Hay, and others is a sense of dread and foreboding of the sort that classical Gothic novelist Anne Radcliffe referred to as terror, this as opposed to the simpler, more immediate sensation of horror. Around this affective core of terror, the principal narratives of these texts usually build out from a case of mysterious illness, often in a child, which acts as a vector through which the text can investigate the larger structural causes of the toxicity in question. And so as the text follows the mystery, the story can move into the deep past, or say into corporate boardrooms far from the extraction site. For example, while the main plot of Heat and Light takes place in present-day Pennsylvania, in the same fictional Carbon Township where several of Hay's previous works have been set, the novel actually ranges from Tehran in 1979 to the Titusville oil discovery 120 years earlier, which launched the age of petroleum. Heat and Light also explores diverse class perspectives through its large cast of broadly typological characters and grapples in a meaningful way with the area's coal mining past, which Hay has also done in previous works. All of this breadth and span makes Hay's book arguably the first big American social novel about oil and gas extraction since Upton Sinclair published Oil in 1927. And it is a measure of the novel's artfulness that agnotological practices shape and pervade the text, but that the precise methods used and the entities employing them are nowhere directly presented. And this leaves the mystery of illness and contamination for readers to unfurl, as we are thrown into the same informational labyrinths that the characters must navigate, and compelled to experiment with the competing interpretations that the text offers. In this way, we are encouraged to develop cognitive strategies that may equip us, in a broader context, to identify and contest the practices of extractive industry. This brings me to the other key claim of my essay, namely that the onset of extreme extraction, in the midst of our present climate emergency, may call for us to expand the ways that we read toxicity in literary texts, and especially in extraction fiction. Currently, the predominant way of reading toxicity, in literature and really throughout the environmental humanities, comes out of posthumanism and the material turn. It uses concepts like diffuse agency, vibrant matter, and the complexity of actor networks to explore how shared experiences of toxicity may unsettle received ideas of selfhood and ecology, and potentially link disparate bodies and ecosystems into emergent political formations. This is a compelling and transformative framework, which has resulted in an array of groundbreaking scholarship. However, as Andreas Malm has pointed out in another context, its complex models of causality and matter can sometimes lead us to pay less attention to the distinctively human agents and institutions most responsible for the present crisis. And it is this possibility that leads me to suggest an alternate, complementary mode of reading toxicity, one that is alert to the industry's disinformational practices and grounded in emerging scholarship on agnotology. And here I'm drawing on recent work in the social sciences by thinkers like Naomi Oreskes, who popularized the phrase merchants of doubt, and Robert Proctor, who coined the term agnotology. In addition, though, I'm also looking back to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which for me still stands as a model for pursuing the transformative vistas inherent to the material turn, without losing sight of the agnotological realities now deforming cultures and ecosystems alike. Carson consistently acknowledges the vast complexities of material events and of toxic diffusion, but she also devotes considerable energy to excoriating the institutional actors who use disinformation to hide toxicity from the public. For this reason, perhaps, Heat and Light invokes Silent Spring no less than 4 times, in each case emphasizing that a major character has not yet opened her copy of the book. This recurring image of Carson's unopened book is, I think, a very optimistic one. Yes, the novel's characters remain in a state of agnosis, of not knowing the nature of the industry's practices in their community. But inherent here also is the promise that knowledge, that the act of opening the book, can bring meaningful change, both personally and throughout societies. With this image also, the novel seems to suggest that it may be fruitful for those who are interested in fossil fuel extraction to return to the work of Carson, whose environmental consciousness, after all, was shaped by her having grown up in Pennsylvania near a pair of coal-fired power plants, with a father who worked at times in a coal mine. More broadly still, the image speaks to how the future of energy depends in large part on the kinds of books that we choose to open. And in that regard, I would suggest that hydrofracking literature can productively contribute to the collective conversations that we will need to continue having in these crucial years to come. Again, I'd like to thank the editorial team who made this special issue possible, and also thank you for watching this video.